Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable life of a woman whose existence was part performance, part endurance, and entirely misunderstood by most of the Western world. The Geisha. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are born in Edo, the bustling heart of Japan, full of tea shops, rice traders, wandering monks, and at least 4 people per block who think they're reincarnated warlords. You're a girl, which means your destiny is already narrowed down to 3 historically thrilling options. Marry someone dull, become a nun, and live with regret, or enter the Okiya, the geisha house, and spend the next 2 decades pouring tea for drunk aristocrats while pretending it's empowering. You are 6. You still think bugs are interesting, and you have no idea that your parents have made a decision. You're going to be a geisha. Not today. Today you're being walked through the streets in your best kimono, which is itchy and far too tight. But soon, very soon, your carefree life of snacks and naps will be replaced by a rigorous education in emotional suppression. The Okiya looks more like a library, married a temple, and raised a child that grew up to be emotionally distant. The woman who opens the door is Oka-san, the geisha house mother. She is the kind of person who can tell how much you're worth just by how you bow. You try to smile. She doesn't. Your parents bow deeply, say a few words, and leave you behind like a very polite hostage exchange. You have officially been handed over. You are not adopted. You are now property. Don't worry, you'll learn to curtsy through the trauma. You're now a shikomi. That's a fancy word for child who scrubs things. You will scrub floors, prepare baths, carry water, and occasionally cry into your sleeve. Silently, of course. Your job is to watch the geisha, never speak, and absorb everything by osmosis. You sleep in the hallway, you eat last. And you owe the house money for the rice you just spilled. The geisha themselves float past you like supernatural beings. Their hair is sculpted, their steps are silent. Their gaze says, "Don't even think about breathing too loudly." You're just a walking sponge in wooden sandals. But you're watching, you're learning, and if your knees hold out, one day you too might glide through a room without being told to fetch the towels. Your days start before sunrise and end when your back stops functioning. You sweep tatami floors, stoke charcoal fires, wash kimono fabric that costs more than your soul, and fetch things. Always fetching. Slippers, water, tea, more water, the good sandals, the other good sandals. By noon you've walked more than most samurai march in a year, and heaven help you if you make noise. Shikomi must be silent. Silent like a haunted house. Speak only when spoken to, and when spoken to, respond quickly, but not too quickly, or it's disrespectful. Also don't look directly at the senior geisha, unless they're looking at you, in which case you're now looking too much. Honestly, blinking is a political act at this point. You're taught nothing formally. There's no classroom. Your entire education is observation, humiliation, and repetition. You learn how to fold an OB by watching someone do it at the speed of light. You practice bowing until your spine files a complaint. You try not to cry during your 15th failed tea pour, but somehow you start to understand how they hold the fan just so, how laughter is timed like a drum beat, how walking is a choreography of toes and timing. You realize being a geisha isn't just about beauty. It's about precision, control, and having the social reflexes of a diplomat in a landmine factory. And yet, you're still just a shikomi. You're invisible until you're useful, and then you're still kind of invisible, but now with a rag in your hand. The older girls might be kind, if you're lucky, or they might treat you like a walking cautionary tale. Either way, you keep your head down and your ears open. Because here's the secret. Everyone started here. Even the most graceful, Impossibly poised geisha in the house once scrubbed this exact floor while being yelled at for drying chopsticks the wrong way. So you endure, quietly, and you wait for your chance to stop mopping and start mattering. Now that you've mastered the fine art of carrying tea and not existing, it's time to upgrade your skill set. No, not dancing or playing instruments. Don't get ahead of yourself. First, you must learn how to sit for hours, without fidgeting or breathing too enthusiastically. Welcome to posture training, the ancient, highly respected Japanese tradition of turning your knees into pretzels and your spine into bamboo. You kneel in Caesar, the formal sitting position where your legs are folded neatly beneath you, your back is straight, and your circulation quietly gives up. At first, your legs go numb after 3 minutes. Then they start whispering threats. After 10, your whole lower body has legally declared mutiny. But you're not allowed to shift, or stretch, or scream. Because geisha are graceful. They do not wince. They do not wiggle. They endure pain like it's an aesthetic choice. You also begin bowing, constantly. There are dozens of ways to bow, each with subtle variations. A greeting bow, a gratitude bow, an apology bow, a please don't punish me for existing bow. You learn to lower your head to precisely the right angle, hold it for precisely the right number of seconds, and rise with a smoothness normally reserved for rice paper unfolding in a breeze. Of course, you'll mess it up. Everyone does. You'll bow too fast, or too shallow, or, horror of horrors, touch the floor with the tips of your fingers at the wrong exact angle. Someone will scold you with the gentle intensity of a disappointed ghost. You also study how to sit during tea ceremonies. Your knees must remain folded even when your soul wants to escape your body. You must move like you are underwater, slow, fluid, deliberate. If you sneeze, congratulations, you've just dishonored your ancestors. But somewhere between the cramping and the internal screaming, something happens. You start to hold your head higher. Your movements become quieter, more deliberate. You become less child, more shadow. This is where you begin to understand. Geisha training isn't about theatrics. It's about control, over your voice, over your body, over how the world sees you. You're learning how to vanish, beautifully. After years of floor scrubbing, knee torture, and developing the posture of a demure statue, you finally hear the words you've been longing for. You're ready to become a Maiko. It's like being told you've been promoted from ghost to ornamental human being. Congratulations. You are now a Maiko, an apprentice geisha, which means, ironically, the real suffering is just beginning. First stop, the hair. Your head will now be turned into a living sculpture. Professional hairstylists arrive with lacquer, wax, pins, and a worrying sense of calm. They twist your hair into the iconic Nihongami style, a towering, complex arrangement that takes hours to create and approximately one poorly timed sneeze to destroy. And you can't sleep lying down anymore. No. You must use a takamakura, a wooden neck pillow designed to keep your head elevated so your precious hair doesn't touch anything, especially common sense. Sleeping like this is a test of willpower and neck strength. You get used to it. Sort of. Eventually. Maybe. Now comes the outfit. Your new kimono is an embroidered beast. It's gorgeous, heavy, and designed by someone who clearly hated shoulders. The sleeves are long enough to sweep a small garden. The obi, sash, is tied in an elaborate knot that sits halfway up your back and weighs about as much as a toddler. Getting dressed each day requires help, often from 2 or 3 other people who have memorized the ancient art of wrapping fabric around a human body until it's 75% kimono and 25% regret. Then there's the kanzashi, your hair ornaments. These are beautiful, seasonal, and sharp enough to qualify as light weaponry. You wear them like a crown, but they also broadcast your rank and training stage. One wrong hairpin, and everyone in the room knows you've committed a fashion crime punishable by shame. As a Maiko, your job is to watch, imitate, and occasionally serve tea while dressed like a sentient cherry blossom. You're not allowed to speak too freely, laugh too loudly, or, heaven forbid, ask questions. You are art, not commentary. But despite the discomfort, the aching scalp, and the inability to sneeze near flames, you feel something else. You're not invisible anymore. People notice you. And not just because your outfit is visible from orbit. There's no single aha moment where you wake up and think, yes, I am now a proper apprentice geisha. It's more like a slow, ceremonial promotion wrapped in silk, incense, and low-grade stress. But the official day you debut as a maiko, that's different. That day comes with ceremony and pressure. Think of it as the Edo period version of a debutante ball, except instead of dancing and punch, there's kneeling, sweating, and at least 2 full hours of hairstyling with hot wax. You've trained for years, bowed more than a religious statue, and memorized the complicated way to pour tea without looking like you're pouring tea. Now, finally, you get to show your face, painted white, of course, to Kyoto's elite, and they are judging you. Politely, intensely, quietly, with folding fans. You wear your most elaborate kimono yet, layers of vibrant silk that cost more than your birth family's home. It's so long it drags behind you like a very expensive regret. Your obi is tied in the Darari style, a long trailing sash that screams, "Yes, I'm new here, please admire my suffering." Your face is fully painted now. White rice powder from forehead to neck. Red and black accents on your eyes. Lips painted in a perfect bow, though only the bottom lip at first, because apparently rookie elegance is a half-lip kind of thing. You walk through the streets in your okobo, those platform sandals that double as medieval torture devices, while everyone turns to stare. Not because you're famous, but because you're a newly minted maiko and it's a rare sight. Also, you're walking very, very slowly. It's the only speed available. Then comes your misadashi, your formal debut ceremony. You meet clients for the first time, greet patrons, and perform for elders who remember when their necks still worked. Every step, smile, and sip of tea is a test. And failure isn't punished with yelling, it's punished with disappointment, which is worse. But somehow, you survive. You make it through the ritual, the performance, the parade. You don't trip, spill anything, or offend a dignitary. This, in geisha terms, is a massive win. And just like that, you're officially a maiko. Half child, half porcelain icon, full-time performance piece. Being a maiko comes with many responsibilities. Pouring tea, dancing, pretending not to hear creepy innuendos. But none of them compare to your most sacred daily ritual. The face. Your makeup routine is now a full-scale military operation. Step 1. Slather your face, neck and chest in a thick coat of white rice powder, which smells like chalk, feels like glue, and somehow finds its way into your soul. It dries faster than your will to live and sets like plaster. Once it's on, you are no longer human. You are canvas. Step 2. Eyebrows. Yours? Gone, covered in powder. New ones, drawn on with charcoal, thin, dark and serious, like they have a secret. Step 3. Eyes. You trace your lids with a mixture of red and black pigment, carefully applied with a brush so thin it could paint on rice grains. One twitch, and you've gone from elegant apprentice to haunted raccoon. And then the lips. As a junior maiko, you're only allowed to paint the bottom lip. Why? Tradition. Also something vague about modesty and not getting too full of yourself. You paint it red, carefully shaped like a tiny bow. It's considered beautiful. It also makes eating look like a complicated art installation. Mistakes are not tolerated. Smudge your lip? Start over. Uneven eyeliner? Unacceptable. Eyeliner doesn't even exist yet. You're using powdered minerals mixed with spit and despair. Once you're done, you look in the mirror and see something both ancient and terrifying. A doll. A glowing, white, fragile, beautiful doll, with the core strength of a dancer and the daily calorie intake of a squirrel. But here's the thing. Beneath the mask, you're learning power. This look commands attention. It says, I'm tradition wrapped in performance, and I will judge your clumsy chopstick technique. The makeup isn't for vanity. It's for armor. It separates you from ordinary women. It tells everyone that you're here to perform, not participate. It also tells your pores that they are no longer needed. Hope you weren't too attached to breathing through your skin. You don't wear this face for yourself. You wear it so others forget you're only 15 and start treating you like art. At first glance, you might think the geisha's greatest tools are her beauty, her kimono, or possibly the sharp metal hairpin she keeps purely for decorative purposes. But you'd be wrong. Her real weapons are twofold, the shamisen and the ancient Japanese art of making awkward men feel interesting. You learn the shamisen, a 3-stringed instrument that looks like a weaponized spatula and sounds like a melancholy banjo. Playing it requires grace, rhythm, and fingers that don't cramp like salted squid. You practice for hours daily, producing noises that begin as cat in distress and gradually evolve into respectable ambience. Your teachers are merciless. 1 missed note earns you a sigh. 2 missed notes earns you a raised eyebrow. 3 missed notes and you're sent back to tune the instrument until it sounds less like a kitchen accident. But music is only half the equation. The other half? Conversation. You're not just learning how to talk. You're learning how to talk around things, how to flatter without lying, how to suggest without promising, how to keep a man engaged in dialogue without letting him realize that you're mentally organizing tomorrow's dance routine while nodding politely. You practice subtlety like it's a martial art. If a client mentions he's rich, you smile softly and change the topic to the moon. If he tries to flirt too boldly, you compliment his taste in sandals and offer more sake. You are the queen of graceful deflection. And oh, the poetry. You memorize hundreds of poems about flowers, rivers, and heartbreak. You can quote Basho while pouring tea and still have enough bandwidth to notice who's had too much to drink. All while keeping your back straight and your voice 1 octave higher than your internal screaming. By now, you've realized that being a maiko isn't about entertaining. It's about managing emotion, your own, your clients', the room's. You read moods faster than you read syllables. You know when to laugh, when to pause, and when to pretend you didn't hear something horrifying. This is your new life. Half musician, half therapist, all performance. And the scary part? You're getting really good at it. Ah, yes. The dana. The word sounds elegant, vaguely mysterious, and just polite enough to hide what it actually means. A wealthy male patron who supports your career with the strings of obligation, woven so tightly they could double as a noose. You hear about the concept early on. A dana, they say, is a respected man who appreciates the arts, funds your training, and helps with the extravagant costs of kimono, hair ornaments, and general survival. In return, you're expected to keep him company, make him feel important, and ideally not run screaming into the night. It's not romantic. This isn't a Jane Austen novel. This is a business transaction wearing a silk robe. You don't get to choose your dana. The house chooses. Your okasan weighs reputation, wealth, and social connections, like a sommelier sniffing out aged insecurity. You, meanwhile, are told to smile and pretend the man in front of you, who is 40 years your senior and breathes like a tired ox, is fascinating. Now, to be clear, not every dana expects certain favours. Some are genuine patrons of the arts who simply enjoy the company of a well-trained, clever woman who can discuss poetry and politics without crying or interrupting. Others are not. The boundaries are vague, culturally unspoken, and the pressure is immense. You owe your house, you owe your future, you owe your knees, which are currently throbbing under another 10 pounds of fabric. And so you learn the art of emotional balancing. You keep things light, friendly, respectful. You become a master of making men feel adored while keeping your soul safely sealed behind a smile. If emotional labour were taxable, you'd bankrupt the shogunate. Sometimes it works out. A dana might sponsor you for years, shielding you from financial ruin and providing just enough distance to keep things bearable. Other times, you develop the lifelong ability to disassociate in real time, while nodding at a story about grain taxes for the 15th time. Either way, the system isn't about love. It's about leverage, and the only way to survive it is to learn how to tilt the balance back in your favour, all while wearing 3 layers of brocade and pretending the room isn't on fire. One day, someone hands you a pair of shoes that look like small wooden buildings and says, "Put these on." They're called okobo, towering platform sandals made of solid wood with no right to exist. Designed not for comfort, but for ceremony, elegance, and possibly revenge, these sandals are worn exclusively by Maiko, which means if you're wearing them, you're now expected to float, not walk, across the streets of Kyoto without wobbling, tripping, or bursting into tears. The okobo make you taller, statelier, less human. You no longer walk like a person. You glide like a shrine procession. The goal is to move with such grace that no one notices you're actually fighting for your life with every step. They have no cushioning. Of course they don't. This is Edo, Japan. Your feet throb. Your calves scream. Your balance becomes a full-time job. God help you if it's raining. Slippery okobo on stone streets turn every trip to a tea house into an Olympic-level obstacle course. The sound they make, a sharp clop, 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 is deliberate. When a Maiko walks down the street, people know that rhythmic click is your new soundtrack. It's beautiful. It's traditional. It also lets everyone in a 5-block radius know where you are at all times. Subtlety, overrated. Eventually, your legs adjust. Sort of. You develop muscles in your ankles that you didn't know existed. You learn to fall with dignity. You perfect the art of turning corners slowly, gracefully, and with just the right amount of theatrical foot placement. And just when you think you've mastered it, someone adds a 12-pound obi to your waist and sends you to a client dinner with 3 flights of stairs. Wearing okobo is a rite of passage. It's also a public reminder that you're still an apprentice. Full geisha wear flatter shoes, because by then they've earned the right to not suffer so visibly. You're still earning it, one wooden stomp at a time. Let's clear something up. A geisha is an entertainer. You perform, you dance, you sing, you pour sake with elegance and flirtation so subtle it could pass for weather. You are a walking work of art whose power lies in restraint. You say just enough. You reveal just enough. You exist in the sacred space between admiration and distance. A courtesan, or oiran, is a high-class companion trained in the art of pleasure. Their job involves layers of performance too, but with one distinct difference. Theirs usually ends in a bedroom. Yours ends with applause, a bow, and sore feet. The visual confusion doesn't help. Both wear elaborate kimono. Both wear ornate hairstyles. But here's your cheat sheet. If the obi is tied in the front, she's a courtesan, quick access. If it's tied in the back, she's a geisha, slow exit. You're welcome. But none of that matters when you're in a room full of men who watched one bad movie and think, geisha is code for exotic invitation. So you develop a skill, the art of politely correcting someone while making them feel like they taught you something. It's linguistic aikido. You say things like, "Ah, how kind of you to be curious. Our traditions are quite different from that." Smile, sip, redirect, repeat. You'll give this same explanation 100 times in your career. It will never stop being necessary. But each time you do it with grace, you reassert the boundary. One smooth sentence at a time. Because being a geisha means never losing your cool, even when someone mistakes you for something you're not. Again, as a Maiko, and eventually a geisha, you are expected to master music, dance, etiquette, and the delicate skill of looking delighted while listening to a man talk about rice tariffs for 2 hours. But your most useful, and least taught, skill? Saying no. Without ever using the word no. See, you can't just reject someone outright. That would be rude. And worse, ungraceful. No one pays a geisha to be blunt. Your value lies in subtlety, in suggestion, in the ability to pivot away from a proposition like a butterfly in getter sandals. Let's say a client gets bold. Maybe he leans in a little too far, compliments your eyes a little too often, or drops the classic, "Perhaps we could meet somewhere more private." You don't slap him. You don't shout. That's amateur hour. Instead, you smile, tilt your head, and say something like, "Ah, you must be very popular with women." This sentence has exactly zero substance, but it flatters him, redirects the conversation, and buys you 10 seconds to refill his cup and pretend that never happened. Another classic. "Oh, what a shame. I'm terribly busy that day." This works, even when he hasn't specified a day. You are always terribly busy, because a geisha's schedule is a mystery wrapped in silk and plausible deniability. Or you deploy the old standard, laughter. Just a soft, amused chuckle, followed by a gentle shake of the head and a change of subject. It's a dance, one where you lead, and they never quite realize it. Over time, you become fluent in the language of deflection. You can reject someone 3 times in a row while making them feel like they're the guest of honor. It's exhausting, yes, but it's an art form. One passed down from woman to woman, like a secret spellbook written in fan movements and passive-aggressive grace. Because here's the truth. A geisha's job isn't to indulge desire. It's to manage it, to channel it, to make the room feel magical, while keeping both hands on the wheel. And if all else fails, smile, bow, and say, "Such an interesting thought." That usually does the trick. The okiya may look serene, paper walls, soft lighting, the gentle strum of shamisen floating through the air. But don't be fooled. It's a battlefield, not one with swords or shouting. No, geisha wars are quieter, sharper, like being slowly assassinated with compliments. Every geisha house is a carefully managed ecosystem, and within it lives a secret jungle of hierarchy, rivalry, and petty vengeance served in silk. You're surrounded by women who are smart, competitive, and trained to smile through open war. Did someone borrow your obi without asking? Oh, how thoughtful. Did another Maiko arrive to dinner with the same seasonal hairpin? How coincidental. Did your shamisen solo suddenly get reassigned to someone else last minute? Just a misunderstanding. The kind that somehow always benefits the more popular girl. You learn quickly. Not all smiles are kind. Not all compliments are real. And never, never, leave your cosmetics unattended. There's a code, of course. You don't scream or slap. That's for the untrained. Here, revenge is served with poise. One extra syllable in a haiku. One wrong step pointed out politely during practice. A subtle whisper to a client that maybe, just maybe, you heard something interesting about that other Maiko's behavior at the last tea ceremony. Rumors in the okiya spread faster than fire on a paper lantern. You try to stay above it, of course. But eventually, you'll get pulled in. Maybe you're the new favorite. Maybe your dance was too good. Maybe someone's just in a mood, and suddenly your sandals are missing. Coincidence? Surely. You survive by learning to be gracious, strategically. You master the art of complimenting someone while implying the opposite. Your new kimono is so bold. I could never wear something so daring. Eventually, you'll rise above it. Literally. As a full geisha, you'll outrank the apprentices and get your own room, your own clients, and fewer accidental spills on your outfit. But until then, welcome to fan wars. They're silent, they're ruthless, and they're fought with grace, timing, and an occasional well-placed eyebrow raise. You don't need armor here. You need a mirror, a memory, and the ability to say thank you like it's a warning. After years of kneeling, bowing, smiling, and resisting the urge to scream into your obi, the day arrives. You are no longer a Maiko. You are now a geisha. The transformation is subtle. No dramatic parade, no congratulatory fireworks. You simply wake up one day, and instead of being the girl in training, you are the standard everyone else is training toward. And weirdly, your knees still hurt. Your wardrobe changes. gone are the vividly coloured, high-sleeved Maiko kimono that made you look like a walking flower arrangement. Your new look is more subdued, more elegant, like you've finally earned the right to dress like someone with opinions. Your hair, thank the gods, it's no longer a weekly sculpture made from wax and willpower. You now wear a wig. Yes, a wig. It's heavier than your head and still takes half a salon and a miracle to style, but at least you can sleep like a normal human again, which is to say, poorly and on a futon. But the biggest shift? You now perform alone. You don't follow anymore. You lead. You're expected to host, entertain, and charm without assistance. Your shamisen solos are longer. Your conversations are wittier. You must be calm, poised, and, above all, in control. Clients no longer see you as cute. They see you as powerful. Not in a sword-wielding, castle-burning way, but in the way that a single raised eyebrow can derail an entire conversation. You've mastered subtlety. You've weaponized grace. People listen when you speak. Or rather, when you choose to speak. Because geisha know the true art of power. Silence used sparingly. And with this new status comes new burdens. You must mentor the younger Maiko. You must smile at clients you've already smiled at 1,000 times. You must carry the weight of legacy, of expectation, of thousands of years of cultural performance. But deep down, something's different now. You're no longer pretending. You've become the person the Okiya sculpted you into. Not just a woman in a kimono, but a living symbol of refinement, mystery, and perfectly calculated emotional labour. You are no longer in training. You are the tradition. So, you've survived. You've danced, poured tea, smiled through centuries of tradition, and avoided tripping in Okobo long enough to reach the unspoken chapter in every geisha's story. What now? Because here's the secret no one tells you. Geisha don't really retire. Not in the traditional sense. There's no ceremony where someone hands you a gold fan and a thank you note. You don't get a pension. You just gradually fade from the spotlight like a candle burned all the way down. Some geisha transition into teachers. You become the one correcting someone's bow angle with a single look. You demonstrate the shamisen for the 100th time, knowing full well the Maiko in front of you is thinking about lunch. You've become the legacy, the living proof that grace ages well and outlives fashion. Others become house mothers, the Okasan. Yes, her. The woman who once judged your bow like it was a criminal offence. And now it's you standing by the sliding door, inspecting the new shikomi with the expression of someone wondering if the rice pot is burning. You run the house. You make the rules. And you decide who rises, and who cleans the entryway again until they learn how to walk without sounding like a stampede. Some geisha marry, discreetly, strategically. Maybe even to a former Dana who's still breathing and has the good manners not to ask what everything costs. You trade one form of performance for another, the art of smiling through domesticity. But many geisha simply continue. Slower, quieter, but still sharp. You host more intimate gatherings. You become less about performance and more about presence. You say less, but it means more. Your nod can shift the tone of a room. Your absence becomes noticeable. There's no grand exit, no final curtain call. You just shift into shadow, still wrapped in silk, still moving like a poem with ankles. And even when your public appearances grow rare, your name stays, passed on by younger geisha who still practice the gestures you perfected long ago. By now, your knees are permanently shaped like tatami mats. Your back straightens on instinct. Your voice, always melodic, holds weight. Not because it's loud, but because it rarely needs to be. You are no longer just a geisha. You are memory made visible. You won't find your name carved in stone or printed in textbooks. You won't trend. There's no viral clip of you pouring tea with surgical elegance or reciting waka poetry between shamisen chords. But your legacy isn't the kind that needs volume. It lives in the next girl, kneeling too long on aching legs, trying not to smudge her lip paint as she perfects a half-smile that hides exhaustion and radiates charm. It lives in the way the fan opens, crisp, precise, and silent, a gesture older than most empires. It lives in the quiet spaces between words at a party, where your presence still shifts the atmosphere, even if no one remembers your debut date or the name of the client who bought your first seasonal comb. Your job was never to be loud. It was to be unforgettable in ways most people wouldn't know how to explain. To captivate, not seduce. To suggest, not declare. To turn a dinner into a ceremony and a glance into a statement. And through it all, you survived. You survived the training, the weight of tradition, the shoes that tried to kill you. You survived assumptions, competition, the clients who mistook performance for permission, and the rumours that never seemed to fade as fast as they were invented. But most of all, you survived elegantly. In a world that demanded perfection and silence, you created space for self-possession. You carved out a life that was both performance and resistance, all while never raising your voice. And maybe no one will say your name out loud when they tell the story of Kyoto. But someone will sip tea just so. Someone will walk in kimono without rustling. Someone will smile with an unreadable gaze and say, "Just enough," and not a word more. And in that moment, you'll still be there. Not as a ghost, but as legacy. Forget candlelit dinners or moonlit serenades. In ancient Sumer, the birthplace of civilization, marriage was less about romance and more about record-keeping. Love was optional. Contracts were not. Sumerians, who lived over 4,000 years ago in what is now southern Iraq, were the first people we know of to formalize marriage with written agreements. And by written, we mean pressed into wet clay using a stylus. These were not declarations of eternal affection. They were binding economic transactions. The cuneiform tablet often spelled out exactly what each party was bringing into the union. And no, unconditional love was never one of the listed assets. The bride came with a dowry, livestock, textiles, servants, or land. The groom's family might toss in a bride price, which was less a gesture of goodwill and more of a deposit. If the marriage failed, the tablet made it clear what was forfeited, refunded, or repossessed. Yes, Sumerian marriages came with early versions of prenups. Your love life could be audited. But the Sumerians didn't stop at cold transactions. Marriage was a cornerstone of maintaining social order. Women were expected to be loyal and fertile. Men were expected to provide and protect, or at least not embarrass the family at public rituals. Infidelity, especially by the wife, could be punished harshly, including death by drowning. Divorce? Allowed, but only if you could prove just cause. We grew apart wouldn't cut it. Weddings themselves were modest affairs, no Instagram-worthy decor or white veils. The couple would move in together and perform rituals, possibly invoking deities like Inanna or Enlil, but the real marriage began when the community recognized the union and the contract was filed like an ancient tax return. The Sumerians viewed marriage less as a personal journey and more as a civil duty. Your union was a cog in the machinery of inheritance, agriculture, and divine order. Your spouse? A partner in social strategy. A teammate in a world where surviving floods and feeding goats took precedence over candle-lit poetry. In ancient Egypt, marriage wasn't just sanctioned by society. It was mirrored in the heavens. The gods themselves were married. Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb. Even chaos had a soulmate. Egyptians believed that divine pairs maintained cosmic balance, and human marriages were expected to do the same. That's a lot of pressure for a couple trying to keep the household cats from eating the sacred grain. Marriage was seen as the ideal social state. A man was expected to marry young, ideally before he could do too much damage as a bachelor. Women married in their early teens, and while love may not have been the focus, companionship and affection were valued. Egyptian love poetry was surprisingly tender. One poem reads, "My heart flutters hastily when I think of you." Another says, "She has stolen my heart with her hair." Not exactly Tinder bios, but it's something. Legal documents were often involved, especially among the upper class. Like the Sumerians, the Egyptians used contracts, with clear stipulations about property, dowries, and divorce terms. But unlike Sumer, Egyptian women had notable legal rights. They could own property, initiate divorce, and sue their husbands for neglect. Queen or not, an Egyptian woman could drag her husband to court if he failed to provide bread, beer, or, crucially, oil. Incestuous marriage was another curiosity, especially among royals. Pharaohs routinely married their sisters. And no, it wasn't because of a limited dating pool. The reason? To emulate the gods. Just as Isis married her brother Osiris, a royal union between siblings was believed to preserve divine bloodlines. Sacred genes, along with a side of genetic risk. Wedding ceremonies themselves weren't elaborate. There was no priestly blessing or public spectacle. A couple was considered married once they moved in together and cohabited. That's it. No doves, no cake, and certainly no throwing of bouquets. The gods didn't need fanfare to approve. Children were the central goal of marriage. Not love, not partnership, not personal fulfillment. Just heirs. The more the better. If your wife couldn't conceive, you might take a concubine or marry a second woman. Love? Optional. Lineage? Essential. In most ancient cultures, marriage was a family affair. In Sparta, it was a military operation. If Sumerian marriage was a business deal and Egyptian marriage a divine mimicry, then Spartan marriage was a survival tactic wrapped in state propaganda and six-pack abs. Here's how it worked. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and tossed into the Agog, the brutal training system designed to produce elite warriors who could kill with a spoon and eat raw roots without flinching. Girls, meanwhile, were trained too, in wrestling, javelin throwing, and sarcastic one-liners. The idea wasn't just strength for strength's sake. It was about producing healthy offspring. A weak child was a liability. A strong child was a future Spartan. So marriage wasn't about candlelight or meeting the one. It was state-mandated breeding. The state even scheduled the ideal marriage age, around 30 for men, early teens for women. Romantic, no? The wedding ceremony was as strange as you'd expect from people who thought iron bars made good currency. Here's how it went. The bride's head was shaved, and she was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. Then she was left alone in a dark room. The groom would sneak in at night, consummate the marriage, and then sneak back out before sunrise, returning to his all-male barracks. Yes, even after marriage, Spartan men didn't live with their wives. The relationship was built on secrecy and quick visits, like ancient Tinder with a curfew. Why all the cloak and dagger? The idea was to keep desire alive. Too much familiarity might make men soft, and softness had no place in Sparta. The mystery kept the spark going, or so the logic went, though modern therapists might have questions. Despite the odd rituals, Spartan women had more power than most ancient counterparts. They could own land, run estates, and insult men in public without being executed. Love poems weren't popular, but wit was. Spartan women were famously sharp-tongued. One told her husband, "Come back with your shield," or "on it." That's basically the ancient Greek version of "don't embarrass me." In ancient India, marriage was more than a personal union. It was a sacred duty, a spiritual journey governed by dharma, the cosmic law. Rooted in the Vedic tradition, marriage was considered one of the key rites of passage, a samskara, necessary for fulfilling one's responsibilities to family, ancestors, and society. Marriage was not entered into lightly. It wasn't merely a contract between two individuals, but a bond between two families, two lineages, and sometimes two entire villages. It was meant to uphold Varna Dharma, the social and moral order, ensuring stability through caste alignment, ritual propriety, and mutual obligation. Arranged marriages were the norm, and horoscopes played a central role in matching partners. Astrologers examined the alignment of stars and planets to determine compatibility. The idea was that cosmic harmony would lead to earthly peace. A good match was believed to bring prosperity not just to the couple, but to the entire household. The wedding ceremony was a complex, symbolic ritual centered around Agni, the sacred fire. The couple would walk 7 steps, the Saptapadi, around the fire, taking vows at each step to nourish one another, to grow in strength, to share in wealth, to be righteous, to raise strong children, to enjoy the seasons of life together, and to remain lifelong companions. With these steps, the two were considered spiritually united. The wife, known as Stridharma Patni, was expected to be both a partner and a moral guide. She managed the household, performed religious duties, and was central to preserving the family's ritual purity. Her role, though domestic, was seen as spiritually vital. The husband was expected to protect, provide, and uphold Dharma through his own conduct. Polygamy existed, especially among the elite, but monogamy was considered ideal. Widows were expected to lead a life of austerity, although practices varied over time and region. The controversial custom of sati, where a widow self-immolated on her husband's pyre, was rare in ancient times and emerged much later, largely outside Vedic ideals. In ancient China, marriage was not a private affair. It was a deeply structured institution rooted in Confucian principles, ancestral worship, and family hierarchy. To marry was not simply to fall in love or to raise a family. It was to honour the past and secure the future, under the ever-watchful eyes of both the living and the dead. The primary purpose of marriage was continuity of the family line. Filial piety, Xiao, demanded that a son marry and produce male heirs to maintain ancestral rights. If a man failed to do so, he not only disappointed his parents, but risked disrupting the family's spiritual duties. Ancestors had to be fed and honoured. A childless home was a broken chain in the lineage, a cause for shame and cosmic imbalance. Marriage decisions were never made by the young couple. Families employed matchmakers who negotiated the terms, inspected backgrounds, and consulted astrological charts. A marriage without proper celestial alignment was considered risky. Compatibility wasn't about chemistry, but about heavenly timing and earthly duty. The 6 rites of traditional Chinese marriage reflected this ceremonial complexity. It began with a proposal, then name exchange, divination, betrothal gifts, setting the date, and finally, the ceremony itself. Each step involved rituals, symbolism, and precise communication between families, a process that could take months, even years. On the wedding day, the bride wore red, the colour of joy and luck, and travelled in a decorated sedan chair to the groom's house. She was veiled, silent, and ceremonially passive. Upon arrival, the couple bowed 3 times, to heaven and earth, to the parents, and finally to each other. These bows signified the order of loyalty. Cosmos first, then family, then self. Once married, the wife entered her husband's household and was expected to obey his parents as her own. Her duty was to bear sons, manage domestic affairs, and serve quietly. While some women gained respect with age or motherhood, their position remained within a clearly defined patriarchal framework. Divorce was rare and shameful. A man could dismiss his wife for disobedience or infertility, but a woman had no such right. The marriage bond, though revered, was unbalanced in power. In ancient Japan, marriage was shaped not by centralized law or religious doctrine, but by centuries of evolving customs, regional traditions, and a profound reverence for nature and ancestors. Rooted in Shinto beliefs, the indigenous spirituality of Japan, marriage was less about formal contracts and more about purity, harmony, and social cohesion. Shintoism teaches that kami, divine spirits, inhabit all things, rivers, trees, mountains, and even people. A harmonious marriage, therefore, was seen as aligning oneself with the natural order. Purity and ritual cleanliness were essential in every major rite of passage, and marriage was no exception. In early periods, marriages were arranged by families, not romantic partners. The goals were practical: alliance building, land consolidation, and continuation of the household line, especially in elite families. However, compared to neighbouring cultures, Japan afforded women a relatively higher status in ancient times. Women could inherit property, manage estates, and wield influence within the household. The typical marriage followed a process known as muko-iri, or groom entering the bride's household. In this custom, the groom moved into the bride's family home, a reversal of the more common patriarchal traditions elsewhere in Asia. This reflected the importance of matrilineal continuity in some regions, especially among powerful families. Over time, however, this gave way to yome-iri, where the bride joined the groom's household, a shift that aligned with growing patriarchal norms. Shinto wedding rituals focused on purification and reverence. The couple would participate in a sansankudo ceremony, drinking sake in 3 sips from 3 cups. Each sip represented a bond between the individuals, between their families, and between their spirits. There were no vows in the Western sense, but the symbolism spoke of unity and mutual respect. Unlike rigid legal systems in other cultures, early Japanese marriage customs were flexible. Polygamy was practiced among elites, but not institutionalized. Divorce, while frowned upon, was possible, especially in cases of infertility or incompatibility. However, public harmony and family honor were always prioritized. The act of separating had to be handled with discretion. In ancient Rome, marriage was not simply a personal milestone. It was a civic institution, intertwined with law, class, and public duty. Romans treated marriage as a reflection of the social order, where alliances were forged, property was transferred, and lineage was preserved under the watchful gaze of the state and the paterfamilias, the male head of the household. Marriage in Rome was categorized into different legal forms. The most traditional was cum manu, where the wife left her family and came under the legal authority, or manus, of her husband or his father. She was no longer legally part of her natal family and became akin to a daughter in her husband's household. Her property became his. This form, however, gradually faded in favour of sine manu, in which the wife remained under the authority of her father and retained greater legal independence. This shift reflected evolving attitudes and the increasing economic power of elite Roman women. Marriage ceremonies were marked by ritual and symbolism. The bride wore a flame-coloured veil called the flammeum, and her hair was parted into 6 locks with a spear, a nod to tradition and the martial roots of Roman culture. The joining of hands, dextrarum junctio, symbolised the union, and offerings were made to household gods, especially Juno, the goddess of marriage. A formal procession led the bride to her new home, where she was welcomed with fire and water, emblems of purity and life. For Roman elites, marriage was a political tool. Senators and nobles used marriages to cement alliances and secure influence. Personal affection, while not irrelevant, was often secondary. Even emperors arranged marriages for political leverage, frequently disregarding their own preferences. Women in Roman marriages were expected to be modest, loyal, and dedicated to running the household. However, Roman women, especially under sine manu marriages, could own property, inherit wealth, and even initiate divorce. Divorce was common and socially acceptable, provided it was handled with dignity. "Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia," the bride would once vow. But if things soured, parting ways was often as swift as declaring intent before witnesses. For the ancient Hebrews, marriage was not just a social contract, it was a sacred covenant guided by divine law. Rooted in the traditions of the Hebrew Bible, marriage was a cornerstone of religious life, lineage, and moral order. It was a relationship that reflected not only human connection, but also the enduring bond between the people of Israel and their God. Marriage was viewed as essential to fulfilling the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. It was expected of all men, and early marriage was the norm. Love, while valued, was not the foundation. Obedience to God and duty to family took precedence. A proper marriage preserved tribal identity, secured inheritance rights, and maintained the purity of the community. Arranged marriages were standard, negotiated between families with a focus on kinship ties, reputation, and property. A bride price, the mohar, was paid by the groom to the bride's family, not as a purchase, but as a formal gesture of commitment and compensation. Women often married in their early teens, while men were slightly older, having established the means to support a household. Ceremonies were domestic affairs, often taking place in the bride's home and followed by a celebratory feast. The rituals emphasized joy, continuity, and blessings, with wine, singing, and the reading of sacred texts. A written ketubah, marriage contract, outlined the husband's responsibilities to provide food, clothing, and conjugal rights. It also protected the wife's financial interests in case of divorce or widowhood. Though patriarchy defined much of Hebrew society, women held an honored position within the family structure. The woman of valor, described in Proverbs, was wise, industrious, and respected. While polygamy existed, especially among early patriarchs like Abraham and Jacob, monogamy became more common over time, particularly after the Babylonian exile. Divorce was permitted but discouraged. A man could issue a get, a writ of divorce, under certain conditions. However, this process required religious approval and was subject to legal limitations, ensuring that the woman was not left vulnerable or dishonored. Among the ancient Celts, marriage was a deeply communal and symbolic act, woven into the rhythms of the natural world, tribal allegiance, and ancestral law. It was less a static institution and more a fluid, adaptable bond, shaped by personal choice, social duty, and seasonal rituals. Unlike the rigid legal codes of Rome or the cosmic obligations of India, Celtic marriage customs varied widely across tribes and regions, from Ireland to Gaul to the Scottish Highlands. Yet, some common threads endured: partnership, fertility, and honour. The Celts viewed marriage as a sacred oath, often sworn in the presence of tribal elders, druids, and the ever-present gods of land and sky. Marriage could be monogamous or polygynous, depending on wealth and status. Among nobles and chieftains, it was not uncommon for a man to have multiple wives, each with her own household standing. However, this was governed by clear expectations and mutual agreement. Women were not passive figures. Celtic women often had legal rights, including property ownership, divorce, and even the ability to initiate marriage. One striking feature of Celtic union was the trial marriage, a year and a day arrangement where couples could live together before deciding whether to continue the relationship permanently. If either partner was dissatisfied, they could walk away without stigma. This custom, far ahead of its time, emphasized consent and compatibility over permanence for its own sake. Ceremonies often coincided with seasonal festivals like Beltane, a fire rite marking the beginning of summer and fertility. Couples would leap over flames or pass between bonfires to symbolize purification and union. These rites were believed to bless the marriage with strength, fruitfulness, and harmony with nature. Marriage contracts, especially among elites, were formalized and could include clauses about dowries, shared property, and inheritance. Unlike many ancient societies, Celtic law recognized mutual responsibilities between spouses. Abuse or neglect could be grounds for dissolution, and women had recourse in tribal courts. The spiritual dimension of Celtic marriage was ever present. Vows were not just personal, they were bound to the earth, the tribe, and the gods. The couple's union was a thread in the larger tapestry of land and lineage, and their fidelity was a promise not only to each other, but to the sacred balance that held the world together. The origins of Malbork Castle lie not in the misty forests of Poland, but in the searing heat of the Holy Land. During the late 12th century, the Teutonic Order was born amidst the chaos of the Third Crusade. Originally formed in 1190 as a group of German crusaders caring for wounded Christian soldiers in Acre, the order soon transformed into a full-fledged military monastic force, part nurse, part knight, and wholly devoted to the expansion of Christendom. but the Holy Land was slipping away. As Muslim armies under Saladin reclaimed territory and European powers lost interest, the Teutonic Knights found themselves without a clear purpose. Their zeal remained, but the battleground would shift. In 1226, the Polish Duke Conrad of Mazovia saw an opportunity. Plagued by raids from pagan Prussian tribes to the north, he invited the knights into his lands, offering them territory in exchange for protection and conversion of the Baltic peoples. The Teutonic Knights agreed. But they had ambitions far beyond missionary work. With papal backing and imperial approval, they began carving out their own theocratic state. In this war-torn frontier, the sword would spread the cross. Brick by brick, they laid the foundation of a new stronghold to anchor their rule. Marienburg, later known as Malbork, Mary's Castle, named in honour of the Virgin Mary, patroness of the order. Construction began in 1274, and from the start it was meant to awe. This was not merely a fortress, it was a declaration. Built in the distinctive red Gothic brick style of northern Europe, it rose from the banks of the Nogat River like a crusader's dream cast in stone. Its walls would not only keep out pagans and rebels, they would proclaim the spiritual and military might of the knights to the entire region. Malbork was more than a castle. It was a base of operations, a monastery, an administrative centre, and a symbolic heart of a rising religious empire. The warrior monks were no longer foreign guests. They were rulers now. And this castle, still in its infancy, would one day become the largest fortress in the world by land area, and a bastion of medieval power that still endures. By the late 13th century, Malbork Castle was no longer just a strategic foothold. It was evolving into a monumental expression of power, faith, and architectural ambition. Rising from the flat lands of the Vistula Delta, it stood defiant and unmistakable, a fortress built not of stone, but of brick, the bold material of the north. In an age where most castles clung to limestone and granite, Malbork's red Gothic walls radiated both innovation and intimidation. The Teutonic Knights didn't simply want a stronghold, they wanted a sacred fortress, where war and worship could exist side by side. The layout reflected this duality. The complex was built in 3 sections: the High Castle, the Middle Castle, and the Lower Castle, each walled and fortified, each serving distinct purposes. The High Castle, the spiritual core, housed the chapel, the chapter house, and the monks' quarters. This was where the knights lived, prayed, and planned. The architecture was designed with religious symbolism in mind. Narrow windows let in filtered light, casting long shadows on cold stone floors. Vaulted ceilings rose like cathedral arches. Defensive features doubled as spiritual metaphors. Height meant nearness to God. Darkness and light symbolized divine truth against the chaos outside the walls. Malbork wasn't just meant to endure siege, it was meant to inspire awe. The Holy Virgin Church, nestled within the High Castle, featured stained glass, intricate tile work, and a statue of the Virgin Mary that towered over the outer walls. Every turret, passageway, and tower was laid out with intent. Nothing was wasted, nothing left to chance. Even the latrines drained cleverly into the Nogat River, a reminder that the knights brought order and cleanliness to a land they viewed as wild and unconverted. As the 14th century dawned, Malbork continued to expand. Craftsmen, labourers, and stonemasons worked year-round. Local peasants were often conscripted to supply food, timber, and manpower. Meanwhile, the fortress became the administrative and spiritual nucleus of the Teutonic Order's growing state. More than just a castle, Malbork was a statement, a brick-and-mortar sermon declaring that the Order was here to stay, both as warriors and as monks. It was faith clad in armour, a monastery wrapped in battlements, and it had only just begun to grow. As the 14th century progressed, Malbork Castle was no longer simply a military base. It had become the epicentre of a growing theocratic empire. From this formidable brick bastion, the Teutonic Knights expanded their control across the Baltic, transforming what was once a campaign of conversion into a full-scale colonization of territory, people, and resources. The order operated like a cross between a kingdom and a corporation. Its Grand Master, essentially both Pope and King within the realm, ruled from Malbork with the aid of a strict monastic hierarchy. Beneath him were knights, priests, and lay brothers, all bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet managing vast estates, trade routes, and tax systems. Their goal wasn't only religious, it was territorial consolidation. Forests were cleared, towns were built, paganism was driven underground or destroyed. Malbork was both the symbolic and logistical heart of this effort. Here the chapter house met to deliberate on policies, elect new Grand Masters, and decide on matters of war and diplomacy. The castle's fortified treasury guarded gold, silver, and relics, all acquired through tithes, trade, or conquest. Its armories supplied swords and armour for new crusades into Lithuania and beyond. With its influence growing, the order styled itself as a civilizing force. Roads and bridges were constructed. Trade flourished along the Vistula River. German settlers were encouraged to migrate, establishing towns with Gothic cathedrals and markets modelled on the Holy Roman Empire. The region became known not for its pagan past, but for its rigid order, under the strict rule of the Black Cross. But with power came enemies. Poland and Lithuania, still largely pagan and fiercely independent, resisted the order's expansion. While some converted willingly, others fought bitterly against forced baptism and foreign control. The borderlands became battlegrounds. Raids were frequent. Tensions simmered. Still, from the safety of Malbork's thick walls, the Teutonic Knights seemed invincible. At its height, the Teutonic Order controlled vast stretches of land stretching from the Baltic Sea deep into Eastern Europe, and at the very centre stood Malbork, no longer just a castle but the capital of a religious state, a monument to faith, power, and imperial ambition. But ambition rarely goes unchallenged. By the dawn of the 15th century, the seemingly unstoppable rise of the Teutonic Order had begun to provoke dangerous resentment. From its brick towers and iron gates, Malbork Castle presided over a domain forged in conquest and enforced through faith. But the knights had made powerful enemies, most notably the newly united kingdoms of Poland and Lithuania. In 1386, a seismic shift occurred. The Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, converted to Christianity and married the Polish queen, becoming King Władysław II Jagiełło of Poland. With this union, Lithuania, the last pagan stronghold in Europe, embraced Christianity, removing the order's core justification for its crusade. The ideological ground beneath the Teutonic Knights began to erode. But it wasn't just about religion. It was about land, influence, and revenge. Lithuania had long resisted the order's invasions. Poland had territorial disputes. Now joined by marriage, faith, and politics, the two kingdoms had the strength to confront the knights directly. Tensions turned into border raids. Raids escalated into war. The showdown was inevitable. In 1410 it came. The Battle of Grunwald, also known as the Battle of Tannenberg, saw the combined Polish-Lithuanian army clash with the Teutonic Knights in one of the largest and bloodiest battles of medieval Europe. The knights, heavily armoured and confident, were outmanoeuvred. Their army was crushed. Their Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, was killed on the field. The defeat sent shockwaves through the Order's territories. But the Polish-Lithuanian alliance didn't stop at victory. They marched directly toward Malbork, hoping to deliver the final blow. As the enemy army approached, Malbork prepared. Its walls were tall, its supplies vast, and its defenders determined. The new Grand Master, Heinrich von Plauen, a brilliant strategist, took command. Siege engines were built, defences reinforced. Archers took their posts. For 2 months, the Allied armies tried to breach Malbork's defences, but the castle held. Arrows rained from battlements, boiling oil spilled from murder holes. Disease and supply shortages plagued the attackers. Eventually, the besiegers withdrew. Though bruised, the order survived. For now. But Grunwald marked the turning point. The aura of invincibility was gone, and while Malbork's walls had withstood the siege, the empire they guarded had begun to crack. Though Malbork Castle had survived the siege of 1410, the Teutonic Order was never the same. Their decisive loss at the Battle of Grunwald had shattered the illusion of dominance. The once rising tide of their theocratic empire began to recede. Their territories remained vast, their fortress impenetrable, but their grip on power was loosening, slowly, then all at once. The Order struggled under the weight of debt, war reparations, and internal unrest. To fund their defence and rebuild their armies, they imposed heavy taxes on their subjects, especially on the growing class of German-speaking merchants and townspeople. But loyalty had its limits. Discontent simmered across Prussia, fueled by economic hardship and the increasingly autocratic behaviour of the knights. In 1454, the situation erupted. A powerful confederation of Prussian nobles and cities, fed up with the Order's rule, appealed to King Casimir IV of Poland to incorporate their lands into the Polish crown. The king agreed, sparking the 13 Years' War, a brutal, grinding conflict that would decide the fate of Malbork and the Teutonic state. At first, the Order held fast. Malbork remained their jewel, their stronghold, but the tide had turned against them. The Polish army, backed by the rebellious Prussian League, pushed deep into Teutonic territory. Unable to pay their mercenaries, the knights made a fatal mistake. In 1457, facing bankruptcy, the Teutonic orders hired troops at Malbork, largely Bohemian mercenaries, sold the castle to the Polish king, not with swords or siege towers, but with silver. Poland walked through Malbork's gates, not as conquerors, but as buyers. The greatest fortress in Christendom had changed hands without a battle. The Teutonic knights retreated to Königsberg. Their state, though not entirely destroyed, was fractured and humiliated. Malbork, once the nerve centre of a militant order, was now a royal residence of the Polish monarchy. From this point on, it would serve kings, not crusaders. The fall of Malbork marked the collapse of the Order's imperial dreams. Their fortress had stood against catapults, sieges, and swordplay, but in the end, it fell to economics and betrayal. The age of the warrior monks was over, and the brick walls that once echoed with prayers and battle plans now whispered of decline. With the fall of the Teutonic Knights in 1457, Malbork Castle entered a new era, no longer the domain of crusader monks, but now a jewel in the crown of the Polish monarchy. King Casimir IV Jagiellon, who acquired the fortress through payment rather than conquest, recognised Malbork not only as a military asset, but also as a potent symbol of Polish ascendancy over Teutonic decline. Malbork became one of the royal residences of the Polish kings, particularly valued for its size, strategic location, and grandeur. Though it had been built for defence and monastic discipline, its architecture lent itself surprisingly well to courtly life. The once austere halls of the knights were softened with tapestries and banners. Grand receptions and diplomatic gatherings replaced chapter meetings and war councils. The castle was integrated into the royal Prussian territories, which were semi-autonomous but loyal to the Polish crown. This placed Malbork at the heart of a multicultural and economically vibrant region. The castle's administrative functions shifted accordingly. Its armories gave way to treasuries, and its watchtowers monitored trade routes rather than warpaths. Under Polish rule, Malbork underwent selective renovations. New wings were added, and defensive features were updated to reflect the changing nature of warfare, particularly the rising threat of gunpowder. Cannon platforms and bastions were integrated into the older Gothic structures, blending medieval design with Renaissance pragmatism. Yet for all its prestige, Malbork's role as a royal residence was seasonal and ceremonial. The Polish kings maintained their primary court in Kraków or Warsaw, visiting Malbork occasionally to oversee affairs in Prussia or host visiting dignitaries. The castle became a symbol of unity and triumph, a reminder of Poland's victory over the Order and its expanding influence in the Baltic region. Despite its reduced military significance, Malbork remained a key stronghold in the defence of northern Poland. It was garrisoned, maintained, and respected, but it was no longer feared. The fortress had traded its monastic discipline for courtly ceremony, its warlike purpose for political prestige. Still, beneath the banners and fine garments, the thick walls and deep moats remained, silent, enduring, and waiting. Though the kings had come, the castle's days of peace would not last forever. By the early 17th century, Malbork Castle once again found itself caught in the crosswinds of war. This time, not as a symbol of rising power, but as a coveted prize in the geopolitical chessboard of Northern Europe. The Swedish-Polish Wars, part of a broader struggle for dominance around the Baltic Sea, would test the fortress anew. Sweden, under the ambitious kings Gustavus Adolphus and later Charles then Gustav, sought control of the Baltic coastline, the so-called Dominium Maris Baltici. Poland, with its sprawling but decentralized commonwealth, stood in the way. The wars between the two powers were long and bitter, driven by religious divides, dynastic rivalry, and the race for regional supremacy. In 1626, the Swedes invaded Royal Prussia. Their disciplined, modernized army quickly advanced, capturing key cities and ports. Malbork, with its thick walls and strategic location along the Nogat River, became a major objective. Though fortified, the castle was no longer the unbreakable bastion it had been in the age of the Teutonic Knights. Cannon fire, now more powerful and accurate than ever before, could batter down even the sturdiest Gothic walls. In 1656, during the cataclysmic period known in Poland as the Deluge, Malbork finally fell. Swedish troops entered the fortress, not as besiegers this time, but through surrender. The castle, undermanned and poorly supplied, could not withstand a prolonged assault. Once again, Malbork changed hands without a dramatic battle, but the impact was no less severe. Under Swedish occupation, the castle was looted and partially damaged. Priceless artifacts, treasures, and archives were carted away to Stockholm. The once revered halls of diplomacy and faith echoed with the tramp of foreign boots. For the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this loss was not just territorial, it was deeply symbolic. Malbork had stood as a triumph of Polish power for 2 centuries. Now, it was another casualty of a nation under siege. The Swedes held the castle for several years, until Poland regained it as part of its eventual, though costly, recovery. But the damage had been done. Malbork was now a fortress marked by occupation, its role as a royal seat fading, its scars visible in shattered walls and empty chapels. War had returned, and Malbork had weathered the storm, but not unscathed. By the 18th century, Malbork Castle, once the beating heart of a military monastic state, and later a proud symbol of Polish kingship, had faded into quiet obscurity. The political world around it was unravelling. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, weakened by internal strife and foreign interference, faced its final partition in 1795, disappearing entirely from the map. Malbork, like much of the region, was absorbed by the expanding kingdom of Prussia. Under Prussian rule, the castle's strategic importance had all but vanished. Gunpowder warfare had rendered medieval fortresses largely obsolete. Malbork was no longer a royal seat, no longer a symbol of conquest. It was a massive, aging structure that was too expensive to maintain and too awkward to modernize. The Prussian authorities found new, mundane uses for its vast halls and echoing chambers. The chapel where Teutonic knights had once prayed became a warehouse. The refectories turned into barracks. Even parts of the ornate interiors were gutted to make room for storage and military supplies. Some structures were dismantled entirely, with bricks repurposed for other buildings in the area. The castle was treated less as a historic monument and more as a convenient pile of usable material, locals and soldiers alike began to forget its past. Centuries of religious, political, and military legacy were buried beneath dust and indifference. Visitors noted its decaying towers, its collapsed arches, and ivy-covered walls. The once proud fortress was now little more than a shell of faded glory, a relic too large to ignore, yet too costly to restore. But even in its decline, Malbork never fully disappeared. Travellers from Germany and beyond occasionally came to marvel at its size, sketch its silhouette, and wonder at its forgotten grandeur. Romantic-era artists and thinkers, enchanted by medieval ruins and stories of chivalry, began to see the castle not as obsolete, but as timeless, a frozen echo of a more heroic age. Still, the castle remained largely neglected, no longer defended, no longer ruled, no longer celebrated. Malbork stood in silence. The walls that had once rung with battle cries, processions, and royal decrees now held only dust, shadows, and memories. It would take a new century, a rising interest in national identity, and a wave of historical romanticism to breathe life back into its weathered bricks. In the 19th century, Malbork Castle's long silence was finally broken. As nationalism swept through Europe, so too did a newfound reverence for the medieval past. Ruins became relics, forgotten fortresses became touchstones of cultural pride. For the Germans, now seeking a unified identity, Malbork, or Marienburg as they called it, emerged as a symbol of Teutonic strength and romanticised knighthood. The restoration began in earnest in the 1800s, led by Prussian architects and historians who saw in the decaying bricks not just a structure, but a story. Detailed studies were conducted. Gothic motifs were carefully reimagined. Sections were rebuilt with painstaking attention to medieval styles, though often with a touch of 19th century artistic license. The process wasn't always historically accurate. Some elements were idealized rather than authentic, but the spirit of revival was strong. Malbork became a national monument of the German Empire. Paintings, operas, and textbooks depicted it as a cradle of Teutonic glory. German emperors visited, and ceremonies were held in its great halls. It was no longer just a castle. It was heritage, myth, and architecture fused into a single powerful icon. But history's tides would shift again. After World War I, the region was contested. After World War II, it was transformed. In 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into East Prussia, Malbork suffered heavy bombardment. Fires gutted the interiors, walls crumbled. Once again, the castle was at war, and once again, it was left in ruins. After the war, Malbork became part of a reborn Poland, and its identity changed once more. No longer a symbol of German pride, it became a reclaimed piece of Polish history, not for conquest, but for preservation. The post-war Polish government undertook another massive restoration, this time aiming for historical fidelity and cultural inclusivity. Brick by brick, it was rebuilt, not as a fortress of war, but as a monument to resilience. Today, Malbork Castle stands as the largest brick fortress in the world, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and a testament to nearly 8 centuries of European history. Tourists wander its courtyards. Historians study its layers. Its walls, once stained by siege and politics, now echo with the voices of schoolchildren and the quiet awe of visitors. Malbork no longer defends, it remembers. In the early 1800s, the United States was a young nation with restless ambitions. Its eastern cities were growing, but for many Americans, the real promise lay beyond the Appalachian Mountains, in the vast, untamed wilderness of the West. This desire to expand was more than a personal impulse. It was wrapped in a national philosophy known as manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined, by providence or purpose, to settle from the Atlantic to the Pacific, no matter what or who stood in the way. What began as a trickle of brave homesteaders soon swelled into a mass movement. By wagon, horseback, and on foot, thousands of families ventured into the frontier, drawn by the hope of cheap land, fresh opportunity, and the chance to escape debt, poverty, or overcrowded cities. Land grants, homesteading laws, and glowing newspaper editorials promised fertile soil, freedom, and ownership, all waiting for the bold to take. But the journey west was not for the faint of heart. Pioneers faced weeks, even months, of grueling travel. Trails like the Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, and California Trail became lifelines across mountains, rivers, and plains. Supplies were packed tightly into wagons, which served as both transportation and temporary homes. Dangers lurked everywhere. River crossings, animal attacks, broken axles, and disease could strike without warning. And yet, the pull of the West remained irresistible. For many, the idea of carving out a piece of the frontier was more than a land grab. It was a shot at reinvention. A poor tenant farmer could become a landowner. An immigrant with no inheritance could start anew. On the frontier, there were no neighbours to impress, no aristocracy to navigate, only raw land and the will to tame it. The frontier was also a place of contradiction. It promised freedom, but it came at the cost of displacing indigenous peoples whose lands were redefined as wilderness. It offered opportunity, but only for those strong or fortunate enough to survive. Still, the myth of the frontier, of rugged individuals braving the unknown, became woven into the American identity. And for those first pioneers, life on the frontier was not just a dream. It was a gamble taken 1 mile, 1 river, and 1 wooden wheel at a time. Once the journey west was complete, if it was completed at all, the real work began. The American frontier did not welcome settlers with ready-made homes or planted fields. It offered only trees, soil, weather, and time. For pioneers, establishing a homestead meant transforming raw wilderness into a space that could sustain life, starting with the most basic necessity, shelter. A log cabin was the structure of choice, not for comfort, but for practicality. Trees were abundant, and tools were few. A family might arrive at their chosen plot with little more than an axe, a wagon of supplies, and sheer determination. First, they cleared the land. Then came the notching and stacking of logs, fitted without nails, secured with mud and moss. Roofs were often made of split logs or thatched grass. Windows were rare luxuries. If present, they were small and often covered with greased paper instead of glass. Inside, life was harsh but purposeful. One-room cabins housed entire families, sometimes a dozen people or more, all under the same roof. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Cooking was done over open hearths, and smoke often filled the cramped space. Bedding might be straw stuffed into cloth sacks. Furniture was rough-hewn and homemade. Every item served a function. There was no room for decoration, only survival. But even in these difficult conditions, life began to take shape. Gardens were planted, small livestock raised. Children gathered firewood and fetched water from nearby streams. Women cooked, preserved food, spun cloth, and tended to illness. Men hunted, trapped, built fences, and defended the homestead when necessary. Each season brought new labour, planting, harvesting, chopping wood, preserving food for winter. Rest was rare, neighbours were few and far between, but when they did exist, they were invaluable. Frontier families often worked communally, raising barns together, helping each other during childbirth, or gathering for seasonal harvests. Survival depended not only on independence, but also on a fragile web of mutual aid. On the American frontier, nature was both provider and adversary. While the land held the promise of bounty, it offered nothing freely. Every meal, every warm fire, every drop of clean water had to be earned through sweat, skill, and endurance. There were no markets, no electricity, no stocked pantries, only what could be grown, gathered, hunted, or preserved. Food was a daily concern, not a convenience. In the early months of settlement, many families relied on hardtack, salted pork, dried beans, and flour brought from the east. These supplies, though essential, dwindled quickly. The long-term solution was self-sufficiency. Gardens were planted as soon as the ground thawed. Corn, beans, squash, and potatoes were staples. Herbs were grown for both flavour and medicine. Nothing went to waste. A single failed harvest could mean hunger, or worse. Meat came from the wilderness. Men and older boys hunted deer, rabbits, wild turkeys, and sometimes larger game like bison. Traps were set for smaller animals. Fishing in nearby creeks provided vital protein, especially during warm months. Every kill was a victory, every successful forage a small triumph over uncertainty. But nature's gifts came with danger. Bears, wolves, and mountain lions also roamed the land, and starvation was never far off in a bad season. Preserving food for winter was a skill that meant the difference between comfort and calamity. Smokehouses, root cellars, and drying racks were used to keep meat, vegetables, and fruits edible through the cold months. Women boiled jars of jam, cured pork with salt, and pickled anything that could fit in a barrel. Firewood was stacked high by autumn. The hearth was the centre of warmth, cooking, and life itself. Weather was unpredictable and often unforgiving. Torrential rains could flood crops. Blizzards could isolate families for weeks. Droughts turned gardens to dust. Lightning struck cabins. Tornadoes flattened them. Illness spread rapidly when water froze or spoiled. There were no safety nets, only preparation, luck, and resilience. While life on the frontier is often remembered as solitary and rugged, few pioneers truly lived in total isolation. Survival might begin with a single cabin, but over time, scattered homesteads grew into something more. Communities bound by necessity, trust, and the shared challenge of taming the land. Neighbours, though miles apart, were lifelines. In the absence of formal institutions, frontier families relied on one another. Barn raisings, harvests, log rollings, and quilting bees were more than chores. They were social events. A dozen men could raise a structure in a day. Women would prepare food, care for children, and offer news from miles away. These moments built bonds stronger than fences. They made survival a shared effort. Without newspapers, telegraphs, or town criers, news travelled by word of mouth. A travelling trader, or a visitor from a nearby settlement, could bring stories from hundreds of miles away. Political changes, rumours of war, sightings of native tribes, or news of a harsh winter coming. Such information passed from cabin to cabin like wildfire. When a family received a letter, it was often read aloud multiple times to friends and neighbours, becoming a shared window into the world beyond. Religion played a unifying role. Itinerant preachers, often called circuit riders, travelled long routes, delivering sermons in cabins, barns, or open fields. Families would walk for hours just to attend a Sunday service, turning it into a full-day event of prayer, song, and fellowship. Faith provided comfort and moral structure in a world where law was still taking root. Education was scarce, but valued. When enough children lived nearby, families might band together to build a one-room schoolhouse. A young woman or older child might teach, using a Bible, a slate, and whatever few books were available. Community events like spelling bees and holiday gatherings offered rare joy and a sense of normalcy amid the hardships. Life on the frontier was not only a struggle against nature, it was also a collision of peoples, cultures, and claims to the land. As settlers moved westward, they entered territories long inhabited by Native American tribes. For the pioneers, the land was a promise. For indigenous peoples, it was home. The result was a tense, often violent balance between conflict and coexistence. Some encounters were peaceful. Trade was common along major trails. Settlers exchanged metal tools, cloth or firearms for furs, food, and local knowledge. Native guides sometimes helped families navigate unfamiliar terrain or warned them of incoming storms. There were moments of genuine friendship, shared meals, gifts, and quiet understanding across the cultural divide. But these moments were fragile, and the pressure of expansion would strain them to breaking. As more homesteads appeared, so did tensions over land and resources. Settlers cleared forests, diverted water, hunted game, unaware or indifferent to the fact that these lands were deeply tied to the spiritual, economic, and ancestral life of native nations. Treaties were signed, then broken. Promises were made, then ignored. As a result, hostility grew. Raids occurred on both sides. Some settlers feared attacks at night. Homes were fortified, rifles kept close. Children taught to stay quiet and hidden. Stories of violence, whether exaggerated or true, travelled fast and stoked fear. At the same time, indigenous communities saw their lands shrink, their hunting grounds vanish, and their way of life threatened by unfamiliar laws and permanent fences. Militias were formed, forts were built. Entire conflicts erupted, from small skirmishes to full-scale wars like the Black Hawk War or the clashes along the Oregon Trail. Some native tribes chose to fight. Others tried diplomacy or moved further west, only to face more settlers in time. There was no simple resolution. Yet even amid conflict, instances of cooperation endured. Some Native Americans worked alongside settlers, married into families, or converted to Christianity. Some settlers adopted indigenous farming methods, herbal medicine, or winter survival techniques. The frontier was a place of blurred lines. Not always war, not always peace. On the American frontier, survival was often credited to grit, strength, and resilience, and no one embodied these traits more quietly and completely than the women of the wilderness. While frontier tales often spotlight men blazing trails or fending off wolves, it was the labour, intelligence, and endurance of women that held frontier life together, day after grueling day. Women wore many roles, often at once. They were mothers, doctors, teachers, farmers, hunters, and protectors, expected to work from sunrise to long after sunset. A pioneer wife might begin her day kindling the fire, milking the cow, and preparing breakfast. From there, she churned butter, mended clothing, tended to children, gathered herbs, and maintained the garden. In emergencies, she delivered babies, dressed wounds, and sat beside the dying, with no formal training, and often no help. Yet women were not confined to the home. Many worked the fields beside their husbands, chopped wood, or helped build cabins. Some hunted small game. Others drove wagons during the westward journey, managing oxen and navigating rugged terrain when men were injured or away. When widowed, which was not uncommon, they took on entire homesteads alone, raising children and crops with little more than raw determination. Women also brought culture, learning, and continuity. In isolated regions with no schools, they taught their children to read and write using family Bibles and borrowed books. They kept diaries, wrote letters, and recorded recipes and remedies, documents that later became rich historical records. Through them, we see the human side of the frontier, the longing for community, the struggle against loneliness, the quiet pride in a well-baked loaf or a warm quilt. They also formed the spiritual and emotional core of many frontier communities. Women organised prayer meetings, holiday gatherings, and mutual aid networks. When a neighbour was ill, they brought broth and comfort. When a child died, they dug the graves and mourned together. Their strength was not always loud, but it was ever-present, steady as the hearth fire. For children on the American frontier, life was not defined by toys or schoolbooks, but by responsibility, resilience, and resourcefulness. From an early age, frontier boys and girls were expected to contribute to the family's survival. Childhood was brief and often harsh, shaped by hard labour, long winters, and the ever-present challenges of a wild and changing land. Daily life for frontier children revolved around chores, not play. Boys were taught to chop wood, hunt small game, tend livestock, and protect the homestead. Girls helped with cooking, spinning, milking cows, gardening, and caring for younger siblings. Children as young as 5 had tasks to complete before breakfast. There was little room for idleness when every pair of hands mattered. That said, childhood on the frontier wasn't entirely joyless. Children found time to play with what they had: a rag doll sewn by hand, a carved wooden animal, or a hoop and stick. They invented games using stones, sticks, or imagination, often drawing from stories passed down around the hearth. Social gatherings like harvests or barn dances offered rare chances for fun and interaction with other children, sometimes many miles away. Education was a privilege, not a guarantee. In many regions, there were no schools at all. Where schools did exist, they were often one-room cabins with a single teacher instructing children of all ages. Lessons were short, and school terms were often scheduled around planting and harvest seasons. Books were rare, paper even rarer. Children learned by reciting aloud, writing on slates, and memorizing verses, often from the Bible. Despite the hardships, frontier life instilled values that children carried into adulthood: self-reliance, discipline, thrift, and toughness. Children learned to care for animals, cook meals, and repair tools. Not for enrichment, but for survival. They witnessed birth, death, and nature's fury up close, often without protection or explanation. These experiences created a maturity far beyond their years. Winter on the American frontier was not a passing season. It was a test of everything a family had prepared for. When the first snow fell, the frontier changed. Trails vanished, rivers froze, trees stood bare, and the wind cut through even the thickest wool. For weeks or even months, isolation became total, and survival depended entirely on what had been done before the cold arrived. Cabins were reinforced. Cracks in the walls were stuffed with moss, clay, or cloth. Firewood was stacked high, cords and cords of it, because once the snow came, going out for more could mean frostbite, or worse. The hearth became the heart of the home. Its fire burned day and night, warming the cabin, cooking the food, and offering a fragile sense of normalcy amid the cold. Food preservation was critical. Families who failed to salt enough meat, dry enough vegetables, or store enough grain often went hungry. Root cellars were dug deep, insulated with straw, and stocked with potatoes, onions, and jars of preserves. Meals were simple but heavy: stews, cornbread, dried fruit, and beans, meant to stretch as far as possible. But beyond hunger and cold, loneliness posed its own danger. Weeks might pass without seeing another soul. Snowdrifts made travel nearly impossible. Letters from back east arrived late, if at all. The silence of the woods was profound. For some, especially women and children, the solitude became unbearable. Cabin fever, anxiety, and depression were common, though rarely spoken of. Families passed the time with what they had: storytelling, Bible reading, mending clothes, carving tools, or patching quilts. Children played quietly indoors, learning to entertain themselves without much space or distraction. Every day was measured by the fire's glow and the stores in the cellar. But even in the deepest cold, endurance took root. Winter was a season of waiting, for the sun to rise a little earlier, for the snow to melt, for the earth to soften again beneath tired boots. And when spring finally came, with its thawing creeks and returning birds, frontier families emerged from their cabins, thinner but alive. By the late 19th century, the American frontier had begun to fade. Railroads cut across the plains. Towns rose where once there was only forest, and the once vast wilderness was divided by fences and deeds. But the legacy of the frontier, its culture, values, and myths, endured long after the last wagon wheel creaked westward. The US Census of 1890 famously declared the frontier closed. The land had been settled, mapped, and claimed. Homesteads became farms, cabins became towns, and territories became states. What had once been a dangerous and unpredictable edge of civilization was now part of the nation's center. Yet the story of the frontier remained deeply embedded in American identity, shaped by those who had endured it. The people who settled the frontier left behind more than log cabins and split-rail fences. They left a national character built on self-reliance, perseverance, and innovation. The idea that one could carve out a life with their own two hands became central to the American dream. The frontier ideal romanticized hard work, personal freedom, and rugged independence, values still echoed in modern culture, politics, and folklore. But this legacy was complex. The same expansion that brought opportunity to settlers came at devastating cost to native peoples. Tribes were displaced, treaties broken, cultures disrupted or destroyed. The landscape itself was forever changed. Forests cleared, rivers redirected, wildlife hunted nearly to extinction. The triumph of the frontier came with irreversible consequences. Still, the stories endured. Frontier diaries, oral histories, and family legends kept the spirit of those early years alive. Pioneers became icons. Men like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, women like Laura Ingalls Wilder, representing courage and endurance. Their lives were transformed into books, songs, and, later, films. The reality was often harsher than the legend, but the myth carried meaning. Today, remnants of the frontier still stand. Weathered cabins, wagon ruts, and gravestones carved by hand. Museums and historic sites preserve the artifacts, but the truest legacy lies in the enduring sense of possibility that the frontier inspired, the belief that a person, no matter their origin, could start over, endure hardship, and leave something behind.